No woman could handle the mountain man's 5 wild sons, until a tiny girl showed up at their door. Now let's dive into this interesting story. The Montana mountains stood tall and unforgiving, their snowy peaks piercing the clouds like white daggers. The air was sharp with pine and smoke, the kind of cold that bit into a man's bones. Down in a secluded hollow half hidden by cedar trees, stood the Boone cabin, strong, wide, and scarred by years of hard living. Inside that cabin was noise. Pure chaos. Boots stomped on the wood floors. A chair crashed over. Somewhere a window shattered, again. "Pop. He threw the stew," shouted one boy. "I didn't," hollered another, ducking as a tin plate sailed past his head. Jedediah Boone, tall, broad-shouldered, and silent as a bear, stood in the middle of it all with his jaw clenched. His dark beard framed a face worn from years of wind and grief. The lines around his eyes were deep, carved by sorrow more than age. He slammed his hand down on the table. "Enough." The word cracked through the room like thunder. For a brief, blessed second, silence. Then a giggle. Then a crash. Jed groaned, dragging a hand over his face. He'd raised cattle, tamed wild horses, survived blizzards. But nothing had prepared him for raising 5 motherless boys. There was Caleb, the oldest at 16, stubborn and moody, already trying to be the man of the house. Eli, 14, all fire and fists. Luke, 12, quiet but quick to follow trouble. Then came Ben and Sammy, the youngest, a pair of mischievous twins who found joy in turning every chore into a disaster. They weren't bad boys, just lost. Ever since their mother, Martha Boone, passed 2 winters ago, the cabin had changed. Her laughter no longer echoed off the walls. Her songs, once soft and sweet at night, were gone. And with her went the peace. The boys had grown wild without her gentle touch. And Jed, though strong, didn't know how to fill that space. He tried discipline, chores, even silence, but the more he pushed, the more they drifted. A pot boiled over on the stove. Jed lunged forward to grab it, cursing under his breath as steam burned his hand. "Can't you boys do one thing right?" Caleb scowled. "We ain't her pa. We can't." The words hit Jed like a hammer to the chest. He turned away before the boys could see the pain in his eyes. "Go outside," he muttered, voice low. "All of you." The door slammed behind them, and for a moment the cabin was quiet again. Jed sank into his chair, staring at the worn spot on the floor where Martha used to stand while cooking. He could almost hear her voice again, soft, calm, steady, saying, "Jed, they're just boys. They need love, not fear." But what did he know of love anymore? Every woman who'd come to help had run off. There'd been Miss Abigail, the schoolteacher who lasted 3 days before declaring the Boone boys untamable. Then Mrs. Clark, the widow from town who'd left before sunset, swearing the cabin was cursed. Even the preacher's sister had given up, saying, the Lord himself would need patience for that lot. No one stayed. No one could. Jed looked out the frost-covered window toward the distant trail. The wind howled, carrying snow and sorrow across the valley. "Maybe they're right," he whispered. "Maybe this mountain's cursed." He leaned back in his chair, the fire crackling weakly before him. On the mantel, a faded photograph showed Martha with the boys, all smiles, no scars. He reached for it, his rough thumb brushing her face. "I don't know what to do without you," he said softly. "They need their ma, not me." Outside, the sound of laughter carried faintly through the cold. The boys were throwing snowballs, shouting, wrestling again. And though Jed's heart ached with the sound, he didn't know that just over the ridge, a tiny figure was making her way up the mountain path, one who would soon bring back everything the Boone family had lost. A little girl with a heart full of kindness, and a destiny tangled with theirs. The morning after the storm rolled off the mountains, a hush lingered in the air, the kind that follows after wind has screamed itself tired. Snow lay thick and unbroken across the trail, glittering under a pale sun. The only sound was the creak of old trees and the faint crunch of footsteps. Tiny ones. A little girl no older than 9 trudged through the snow, her boots far too big and her coat far too thin. A patchy shawl fluttered around her shoulders like a worn flag of bravery. Her small hands clutched a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were a few wildflowers, long wilted, and a loaf of bread she'd baked herself 2 days before. Her name was Lucy May Carter. She had no horse, no guardian, and no plan except one, to find the cabin of the Boone family, the one she'd heard whispers about in town. The cabin where no woman lasted a single day. She remembered the words she'd overheard at the general store. "Them Boone boys are wild as wolves. That mountain man's got no heart left since his wife died. Ain't nobody fool enough to go up there." Lucy had listened quietly, her small fingers tracing the wooden counter as she thought, maybe they just need someone to be nice to them. Now here she was, a child alone on the mountain walking toward the very place grown women had fled. Her legs ached, her lips trembled from the cold, but her eyes still held light. She hummed softly to herself, a tune her mama used to sing before she got sick. When the cabin came into view, it looked almost like a beast itself, huge, rough, and silent. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy spirals. The front yard was a battlefield of half-broken toys, a wooden fence leaning sideways and boot tracks stamped deep in the snow. Lucy hesitated at the edge of the clearing. Her breath puffed out in white clouds. "You can do it, Lucy May," she whispered to herself. "They're just people. Just people who forgot how to smile." With that, she walked up to the door and knocked. The sound was so small it was nearly swallowed by the wind. She tried again, harder this time. From inside came shouting, boys' voices. The door swung open so fast she nearly toppled backward. There stood Jedediah Boone, taller than the doorway itself, his beard frosted, his eyes wary and tired. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "What in the world?" He looked down, and his expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "Girl, you lost?" Lucy shook her head, clutching her bundle tighter. "No, sir. I came to help." Jed frowned. "Help?" He glanced past her, half expecting to see a wagon, a family, anyone. But there was only snow. "You come up here alone?" "Yes, sir," Lucy said softly. "I heard your boys don't smile no more. I thought maybe I could fix that." Behind him, the 5 Boone boys crowded the doorway, faces dirty, eyes curious. Eli snorted. "You? Fix us." Ben giggled. "She's smaller than Sammy." Sammy, the youngest, puffed his chest. "Hey." The boys laughed, pointing at her ragged shawl, but Lucy just smiled, a soft, patient smile that didn't waver. "That's all right," she said. "My brothers used to laugh too. They said I couldn't even lift a bucket. But I can lift a heart if you let me." For a long moment no one spoke. Snow drifted around them like falling feathers. Jed sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Listen, girl, we don't need." Then from inside the kettle began to whistle, the sound sharp, lonely. Something about it made him stop. He looked back at the boys, then at Lucy, her tiny face flushed from the cold, her eyes full of something he hadn't seen in years, gentleness. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside. "You can come in till the wind dies down. Then I'll see you back to town." Lucy nodded politely, stepping over the threshold as if entering a church. The cabin was warm, smoky, and cluttered with chaos. Dishes piled high, socks hanging from the mantel, tools scattered everywhere. She didn't wrinkle her nose or flinch. Instead, she looked around and whispered, "It's cozy." That made the boys stop and blink. No one had ever called their home that. Within minutes, Lucy had taken off her shawl, set her bundle on the table, and begun clearing a small space to set down the bread. "I brought this," she said, smiling shyly. "It's not much, but it's better shared." The boys eyed it suspiciously. Jed leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying not to care, but deep down he was watching her closely. Who was this strange little girl who wasn't afraid of them? Who walked into their storm like sunlight through a crack in the clouds? Outside, the wind began to howl again, but inside the Boone cabin, for the first time in a long while, there was peace. Just a faint one, small and fragile like the girl herself. But it was enough to make Jedediah Boone wonder if maybe, just maybe, this child hadn't come by accident. Morning light spilled through the cracks in the Boone cabin, painting stripes across the floorboards. The boys were already up, stomping around, arguing over breakfast. Jed stood by the stove, stirring a pot of thin porridge with the patience of a man who'd seen too many mornings start this way. Except this morning wasn't quite the same. At the table sat Lucy May Carter, her hair still damp from washing, her sleeves rolled up as she tried to help set the table. Though half the bowls didn't match and the spoons looked like they'd been carved by a bear. Jed kept glancing at her from the corner of his eye. She was out of place here, fragile in a room built for rough hands and loud voices. He didn't understand what kept her from running. When the boys began bickering again, Lucy didn't flinch or raise her voice. She simply hummed that same soft tune she'd been humming since she arrived, low and gentle like wind in the pines. Slowly, one by one, the boys quieted to listen. "What's that song?" little Sammy asked. Lucy smiled. "It's one my mama used to sing when we were scared. It means everything's going to be all right." Jed felt something twist inside him. When we were scared. He hadn't thought about fear in years, he only thought about survival. But hearing that little girl's calm voice made him realize how frightened his boys had been all this time, even behind their laughter and noise. After breakfast, the boys decided to test her. Ben hid a frog in her boots. Eli poured flour into her hair when she wasn't looking. Luke took her shawl and hung it from the rafters, just to see if she'd cry. Jed didn't stop them. Part of him wanted to see if this small stranger was really made of the kindness she carried. When Lucy found the frog, she didn't scream. She giggled softly and carried it outside. "You don't belong in boots, little one," she whispered, setting it near the stream. When Eli dumped the flour, she brushed it off and smiled. "Now I look like a snow angel." And when Luke pointed to her shawl hanging high above, Lucy didn't get mad. She climbed onto a chair, stood on tiptoe and tried to reach it. When she couldn't, she laughed. "Guess it's resting up there. Everything gets tired sometimes." The boys didn't know what to do with that. No shouting. No anger. No tears. Just gentleness, something they'd forgotten how to react to. Later that day, Eli tripped while hauling in firewood and scraped his knee on the frozen ground. The boy tried to hide it, embarrassed. But Lucy saw the blood and hurried over, kneeling beside him. Without a word, she tore a strip from her dress hem, that same faded blue cotton she'd worn since she arrived, and wrapped it around his knee. "There," she said. "All better." Eli blinked, stunned. "You tore your dress?" "It's just cloth," she said simply. "You're not." Jed watched it all from the doorway, arms crossed, a strange warmth creeping into his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not since Martha. That evening, as the fire burned low, Lucy began to hum again. The boys sat around her, listening. One by one they started joining in, not perfectly, not in tune, but with something real. Something soft. When the song ended, the cabin was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't come from exhaustion or anger, but peace. Jed finally spoke. "You planning to stay long, girl?" Lucy looked up from the firelight, her eyes reflecting the glow. "I'll stay until you smile, Mr. Boone." The boys laughed, but Jed didn't. Not right away. He just stared at her, this tiny, fragile girl who'd walked into their wreck of a home and brought something even stronger than discipline. Kindness. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. But it was powerful enough to make 5 wild boys sit still by a fire, and a hardened man remember what warmth felt like. Outside, snow drifted quietly over the roof. Inside, the Boone cabin, once filled with shouting and sorrow, began for the first time in years to feel like a home. Winter deepened over the Montana mountains, wrapping the Boone cabin in white silence. Days were shorter, nights longer, and the wind carried the kind of cold that could hollow a man's heart. But inside the cabin, something had begun to thaw. The days that used to start in shouting now began with laughter, uneven, sometimes loud but warm. Lucy had been with them nearly 2 weeks, and already her presence had woven itself into their lives like thread through torn cloth. That morning, Jed Boone stepped outside to chop wood. He paused when he heard it, the sound of children laughing. Not the rough, wild laughter that used to echo through his walls, but soft and genuine. He leaned his axe against the porch rail and peered through the frosty window. Inside, Lucy sat cross-legged by the fire with the 5 Boone boys gathered around her. She had found an old box of books, dust-covered and forgotten, the same ones Jed's late wife Martha used to read from before she died. Lucy carefully turned the brittle pages, her voice lilting and kind. "This one," she said, holding up a book with a faded green cover, "is about a boy who thought he was too wild to be loved. But someone showed him he wasn't." The boys leaned closer. Even Eli, who usually rolled his eyes at anything that sounded like a story, listened with quiet curiosity. As Lucy read, her voice filled the room with something that had been missing: gentleness. It wrapped around the boys like a blanket, softening the sharp edges of their grief. When she finished, she handed the book to Caleb, the oldest. "You can read the next part tomorrow," she said. "If you want." Caleb hesitated. "I don't read so good." Lucy smiled. "Then we'll learn together. That's what families do." Jed froze outside the window, the axe still in his hand. Family. The word hit him harder than any storm. That night, after supper, Lucy found him sitting alone on the porch. She stepped out quietly, wrapping her shawl tight around her small shoulders. "You don't talk much, Mr. Boone," she said softly. Jed looked down at her. "Ain't much to say." She tilted her head. "You don't have to talk a lot to be kind." He frowned, not sure how to answer that. The wind rustled through the pines. Lucy's gaze drifted toward the stars. "You know, your boys love you. They just don't know how to show it. My mama used to say when people act mean, it's mostly because they're hurting inside." Jed's jaw tightened. "Your mama sounds like she knew a lot." She did, Lucy whispered. She said kindness is like firewood, the more you give, the warmer everyone gets. Jed swallowed hard. That simple phrase stuck deep in his chest. He thought of Martha, how she used to say nearly the same thing when she was alive. Inside, the boys were arguing again, but this time about who got to sit closest to the fire. Their voices weren't angry, just young and full of life. Lucy turned toward the door. I think I'll make them some cocoa, she said with a small smile. Would you like some too? Jed shook his head, watching her go. She was just a child, fragile, poor and small, but somehow she was teaching his sons more than any preacher, teacher or caretaker ever had. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and snow whispered against the window, Jed found himself sitting beside the boys as Lucy read aloud again. Her voice was steady, sweet, a melody that seemed to heal something deep inside each of them. When she reached the end of the story, Sammy leaned against her arm and whispered, "Can we have another?" Lucy smiled, tucking the blanket around his shoulders. Tomorrow night. Good stories take time. Jed felt his throat tighten. He looked around the room, his boys sitting still, content and smiling. Martha's old books open again. The cabin filled with warmth. It was then he realized something. This little girl hadn't just brought kindness. She'd brought hope. The same kind of hope his wife had once carried in her eyes. And though Jed didn't say it out loud for the first time in years, he silently thanked God for sending a small lost girl up the mountain that day. The mountain had a way of reminding folks who was in charge. One day the air would be still, the sun glinting on the snow like diamonds, and the next the wind would roar down from the peaks, wild and merciless. That evening, as dusk crept through the pines, Jedediah Boone felt it in his bones. A storm was coming. He stood on the porch looking out toward the valley below. The horizon was bruised with dark clouds rolling in fast. The air felt thick and heavy, the kind that made the hairs on a man's neck rise. Inside, Lucy and the boys were laughing, a rare bright sound that carried through the cracks in the door. They were playing some game she taught them, something called Button, where she hid a shiny button in her hands and made the boys guess who had it. Jed smiled faintly at the sound, but it didn't last long. His eyes drifted back to the darkening sky. Get the shutters closed, he called through the door. Storm's brewing. Within an hour, the wind began to howl like a beast let loose from its cage. The trees moaned, snow whipped across the clearing and the temperature dropped fast. By nightfall it was a full blizzard. The Boone cabin shuddered under the assault. The boys huddled close to the fire while Jed checked the roof and bolted the door. Keep that fire fed, he ordered. And don't move from that spot. Lucy, sitting by the hearth, looked calm, but inside, her little heart pounded. She'd never seen a storm so fierce. The wind screamed through the cracks in the wood, snow seeping through in tiny white flurries. A sudden crash shook the cabin. One of the back windows had burst inward, spraying glass and snow. The fire sputtered from the cold gust that followed. "Pa!" Caleb shouted. "The window's out." Jed spun around just in time to see Lucy jump to her feet. "Stay back," he barked, but she was already moving. The girl ran to the corner, grabbed an old quilt from the cot, and pressed it against the broken window frame. The wind roared, nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow stung her face as she struggled to hold it in place. Jed lunged forward, catching her by the arm before she could fall. "You fool girl," he shouted over the storm. "You'll freeze." But Lucy just looked up at him with trembling lips and said, "It's your boys' room, sir, they'll be cold." Jed stared at her, this small, shaking child, and something inside him broke wide open. He pulled her back, wrapping her in his coat. "You're more woman than most I've met," he muttered, voice rough. Together they worked through the night. Jed and the older boys nailed up boards and stuffed rags in the cracks. Lucy tended the fire, keeping it alive with what little would remain. When the flames began to fade, she fed it the last pages of one of the old, torn books. "Stories can wait," she whispered, tossing them in. "Warmth can't." By midnight, the storm's fury was deafening. The roof groaned and one of the rafters cracked. Jed shouted for the boys to move the table and gather close to the hearth. He kept Lucy near him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She looked up at him through sleepy eyes. "It's loud, but it sounds like the sky's singing." Jed blinked. "Singin'?" "Yes," she said softly. "Maybe God's just reminding us he's still here." And somehow, in that moment, amid the roaring storm, Jed believed her. Hours passed before the wind finally began to fade. By dawn, the cabin was battered but still standing. Snow piled halfway up the door and icicles hung from the roof like daggers. Inside, the Boones were safe. The boys slept in a pile by the fire, Lucy nestled between them, her tiny hand still clutching a bit of the burned quilt. Jed sat awake, watching the embers glow. He looked around the room, at the faces of his sons, at the girl who'd risked herself for them, at the warm orange light flickering against the wood walls, and for the first time in years the cabin didn't feel empty. He whispered into the silence, his voice almost a prayer. "Thank you, for sending her." Outside the storm had passed. The sun broke through the clouds, shining down on the mountain, and a single wisp of smoke rose steady from the Boone chimney, not the sign of a lonely man's home anymore, but of a family that had weathered the storm together. Spring crept slowly down the mountain, melting the last of winter's bite. Snowdrifts turned to muddy streams, and the air carried the scent of pine sap and damp earth. The Boone cabin, once a place of shouting and sorrow, now hummed with gentle life. Lucy had been there for months. Every morning she helped Sammy and Ben feed the chickens, taught Luke to spell his name in the dirt outside, and showed Eli how to fix torn shirts with clumsy stitches. Caleb, quiet, strong Caleb, had even learned to read, slowly sounding out each word beside her in the evenings. And Jedediah Boone? He found himself listening more and shouting less. The cabin felt alive again. The air was full of small sounds, laughter, pages turning, a broom sweeping, Lucy's soft humming. It was as if Martha Boone's spirit had returned, carried in the tiny frame of a girl who refused to stop caring. But peace on the mountain never lasted long. One morning as Jed was splitting logs by the barn, he saw a dark speck moving up the trail, a horseman climbing toward the cabin. Visitors were rare out here. He wiped his brow and waited as the rider came closer, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. "Jedediah Boone?" the man called, stopping near the porch. "Got a letter for you. From town." Jed frowned. "From who?" The man shrugged. "Orphan office." He tipped his hat and rode off before Jed could ask more. Inside, Lucy and the boys were setting the table for breakfast when Jed stepped in, envelope in hand. The moment his eyes caught Lucy's, she knew something was wrong. He didn't speak at first. Just stood there, turning the letter over in his rough hands before tearing it open. His eyes moved across the page, slow, heavy, and his shoulders seemed to sink with each word. "What is it, Pa?" Caleb asked quietly. Jed's voice came low, tight. "They're looking for her." Lucy froze. "For me?" Jed nodded, his jaw tight. "They say you ran off from the orphanage in town. Been gone near 5 months. They want you brought back." The room fell silent. The only sound was the fire's low crackle. Ben's eyes went wide. "They can't take her, Pa." "She belongs here," Sammy cried, clutching Lucy's sleeve. Eli slammed his fist on the table. "They don't know her like we do." Lucy just stood there, small and trembling, her hands twisting in her skirt. I didn't mean to run," she whispered. "I just wanted to help. I thought maybe," her voice broke, "maybe someone needed me." Jed crouched in front of her, his weathered face softening. "You listen to me, little one. You didn't do wrong by coming here. You gave us back more than we ever thought we'd have." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then why do I have to go?" Jed opened his mouth but couldn't find an answer. He stared at the letter again, the neat black ink spelling out rules and orders, words written by people who'd never stepped foot on this mountain. That night, the cabin was quiet. No games. No laughter. No stories. Lucy sat by the fire, holding one of the old books close to her chest. The boys were too sad to speak. Even the flames seemed dimmer, as if mourning with them. Jed sat in his chair, letter crumpled in his hand, watching her. She looked up after a long silence. "You don't have to worry, Mr. Boone. I'll go back tomorrow. They'll take me in again." He shook his head slowly. "Ain't that simple?" Lucy smiled through her tears. "You already gave me what I needed." "What's that?" "A home." Her voice cracked on the word. Jed felt his heart twist, a feeling he thought had long died with his wife. He wanted to tell her to stay, to promise she'd never leave, but the law was the law. And he was a man who'd never learned how to fight the world beyond his mountain. When the fire finally burned down to embers, the boys asleep beside her, Jed whispered into the stillness, "You're not leaving, Lucy May. Not if I can help it." He didn't know how, but come sunrise he intended to find a way. Dawn broke over the mountain in pale gold streaks. Mist curled through the pines and the cabin sat quiet, too quiet. Lucy's small satchel was already packed, sitting by the door. She hadn't slept much. Neither had Jedediah Boone. The boys stirred in their bunks, their eyes red from tears they tried to hide. Caleb, the eldest, spoke first. "Pa, you ain't really gonna let them take her, are you?" Jed stared at the window, his jaw working. We don't own people, son. But she's family, Eli said, his voice cracking. She made us a family again. Jed didn't answer. He only reached for his hat, tucked the letter into his coat and stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, like the sound of something ending. He saddled his horse, glancing once toward the cabin window where Lucy watched him with wide, tearful eyes. "Stay here with the boys," he said softly. "I'll be back before sundown." And with that he rode down the mountain. The ride to town was long and rough, the trail still slick with melting snow, the air sharp and cold. As Jed rode, his thoughts churned. He remembered the day Lucy first appeared, small as a sparrow, covered in mud and determination. How the boys had stopped fighting. How laughter had returned to his home after years of silence. He'd buried one wife, but somehow this little girl had dug up the part of him that still believed in goodness. He couldn't just let that go. By midday he reached the town of Cedar Creek. The people stared as the mountain man dismounted, his coat dusty, his beard wind-blown. He walked straight to the small wooden building marked Cedar Creek Orphan Office. A woman in a stiff gray dress looked up from behind the desk. "Can I help you, sir?" Jed dropped the crumpled letter onto her papers. "You sent this." She adjusted her spectacles, frowning. "Yes. About the runaway girl, Lucy May. You found her then?" Jed's voice was rough but steady. "She found me." The woman blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "She's been livin' with me and my boys. Fed 'em, taught 'em, kept 'em from tearing each other apart. That child's got more heart than half the grown folk in this town. She belongs with us." The woman pursed her lips. "Mr. Boone, the law's the law. She's a ward of the state. She can't simply live with strangers." Jed leaned forward, eyes burning with quiet fire. "She ain't a stranger to us. And I ain't a skin for permission. I'm a skin for papers. Papers. Adoption. Guardianship. Whatever it takes." The woman hesitated. "You understand that's a long process." Jed's voice cut through the air. Then started. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the office clock. Finally she sighed, pulling a file from the cabinet. "You'll need to sign these, Mr. Boone. And you'll need a witness." Jed turned to the open doorway, where, to his surprise, Sheriff Miller leaned against the frame, arms crossed and a knowing smirk on his face. "I reckon I can be that," the sheriff drawled. "About time someone gave that little one a proper home." Jed exhaled, relief washing over him like sunlight through storm clouds. When Jed rode back up the mountain that evening, the boys were waiting at the fence, eyes full of hope. Lucy sat on the porch steps, her small hands clutching the edge of her skirt. He swung off the horse and walked toward her. For a moment he didn't speak, just knelt down in front of her like he had the night before. "Well," he said, his voice thick. "Seems I had some papers signed." Lucy blinked. "Papers?" He smiled softly. "Says you're a Boone now if you'll have the name." Her eyes went wide. "You mean I can stay?" Jed nodded. "If you're willin'. She threw her arms around his neck, sobbing into his shoulder. The boys hooped and hollered, running circles around them. Even the old hound barked like he knew something good had happened. Jed's arms tightened around her small frame. "You turned this place into a home, little one," he murmured. "Guess it's only right you stay in it." That night, laughter filled the Boone cabin again, louder than it had ever been. Lucy sat by the fire, the boys leaning against her as she read aloud from their worn storybook. Jed watched from his chair, a soft smile tugging at his lips. The mountain outside was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in years, it felt like the Boone family, wild sons and all, was whole. And in the soft glow of the firelight, little Lucy looked up and whispered, almost to herself, "Home. I finally have a home."